Last time, we talked about Hoa Hakananaya, the Easter Island sculpture in the British Museum. Today, I want to look at another object in the collection, and I want to talk a bit more about repatriating objects to their country of origin. One thing the British Museum is really famous for is having objects of questionable origin on display. Of course, not everything, or even most things in the British Museum are stolen. You have things that were donated by their legal owner, like the Sutton Hoo finds. You have things that their archaeologists found on digs. And you have things that they bought or commissioned, like this figure by the British Trinidadian artist Zach Ove. But some have notoriously contested origins, like the Parthenon sculptures, known as the Elgin marbles. Greece has been asking for these back since at least the 1970s, and famously, the British Museum has always, thus far, turned them down. Or the collections of Sir Stamford Raffles, who was the colonial governor of Java in the 19th century. He collected a lot of stuff from the island. Some of it he probably bought fairly, but some of it he probably seized. Or the Guigal shield, which for years was displayed as the shield Captain Cook stole from an Aboriginal Australian whom he shot when he first landed at Botany Bay. With all of these, the origins have, to some extent, been accidentally or deliberately obscured over the years. Elgin claimed to have papers legally giving him the marbles, but the papers were lost. Stamford Raffles' documentation was all lost in a shipwreck. And in 2018, the British Museum declared that this isn't the Guigal shield after all. So, arguments about whether they should go back turn into arguments about whether this or that was technically stealing, rather than arguments about whether sending them back is the right thing to do. But the objects I want to talk about today do not have this kind of obscure origin. No one is arguing they weren't stolen. They definitely were. They are also beautiful objects of art in their own right. In European art, we're used to thinking about art in terms of painting and sculpture, but in Africa, other forms have traditionally been more important, like textiles, pottery, or in this case, metal casting. Our objects for today are these bronze-coloured plaques that are unique to the Kingdom of Benin. They pop up in museums all over the world, from Germany to the US, but the British Museum in London has a whole wall of them in their Africa gallery. So today, we're going to talk about what they are, what makes them unique and beautiful, and whether they should be given back. Chapter 1. The Kingdom of Benin. Our story starts in the Kingdom of Benin, not to be confused with the modern-day Republic of Benin. The Kingdom of Benin was actually in modern-day Nigeria, and it lasted from at least 1180 until 1897. At its height, 2 million people lived in Benin. It was known for its huge walls and its powerful military. Benin made lots of money from tolls on waterways and entering Benin City, and tributes from conquered peoples. It was home to lots of different ethnicities, like the Itsekiri, the Esan, and the Urhobo, but predominantly the Edo people, whose language is also called Edo. The king of Benin is called the Oba, and there is still an Oba to this day. This is Eware II. Before he became Oba in 2016, he worked at the UN and as a Nigerian ambassador. Under the Oba are chiefs, some hereditary, most appointed, who are a bit like courtiers and representatives of the Oba. To this day, Benin still has about 600 chiefs. The lives of the royal family and the chiefs are really regimented. There are specific haircuts that only they are allowed to wear. Their wives aren't allowed to sit on the same sofa as an unrelated man. There are laws about what kinds of cloth you're allowed to wear, what kinds of insignia you're allowed on your gate. And lest you think this is just etiquette, the Oba has enforcers that will come to your house and check you're following the rules, and if you're not, you get fined. What they do and wear is reported on in gossip magazines, just like you might hear about Princess Eugenie in Hello. Oba are often great patrons of the arts, and they employ artists and craftspeople on their staff to make things for the palace, like these plaques. Right, I've hyped them up enough. Let's talk about them. Chapter 2. the art. The first thing to note is that they would be fixed to the walls and columns of the palace all over. So just seeing one plaque on its own doesn't really give you a good impression. It's like trying to imagine a whole room from a scrap of wallpaper. You have to imagine hundreds of these things all over the columns. They're actually made of brass, not bronze, although you'll often hear them called bronzes, and they are bronze coloured. You also have to imagine them looking bright and shiny. While they were on display in the Benin court, they'd be kept polished. However, the European sensibility is to have dark coloured bronze. So when they came to Europe, people oiled them, making them darker. Sometimes the oil has sunk into the metal, and if we tried to remove it now, we'd scrub details off the artwork. Brass is made of copper and zinc, and copper was used as money in this period. So the Oba is literally covering his house in money. Like, imagine if the Queen covered Buckingham Palace in £50 notes. You were meant to be dazzled. Each one is a little different, but there are some themes that crop up over and over. You'll often see the Oba in the middle, flanked by two other men, and it is almost always men. You'll see them drawn with hieratic scale, so more important people are drawn literally bigger than everyone else. Hieratic scale is something that crops up in art all over the world. Having an entourage like that is really important in the Benin court. For example, when a new chief is doing his parade around town, he's expected to have several wives in his entourage. Chiefs who aren't polygamous do still want to have that effect because it's tradition, so they'll use like pretty cousins and sisters to make up the numbers for the parade. Dr. Kathy Kernau tells the story of one chief who inherited the position when he was 12. Obviously, he didn't have any wives yet, so he roped in some classmates. But his classmates weren't from high-born families and they didn't know the etiquette. So, for example, you're meant to be very stoic, like you're not meant to show your emotions on your face. And these girls were like laughing and giggling the whole way through. They thought the ceremony was hilarious. The young chief was a little embarrassed. You can also spot the Oba from his high crown, a little bit like a helmet, and his very high collar made of coral beads. Coral is said to be a prize from the god of the sea, and it's always associated with royalty. The more coral you have, the more important you are. For ceremonies today, you might still see the Oba covered head to toe in coral beads, even on his shoes. You might see leopards or leopard imagery. Leopards are considered symbols of royal power, a bit like lions are in the UK. The leopard is the king of the forest, after all. The Oba used to keep leopards as pets, and they took them out with them on parades. So anyone with pictures of leopards, leopard skin leather, leopard tooth necklaces must be in favour with the Oba. Mudfish are another symbol of the Oba. Mudfish are a strange kind of fish that can live both in and out of the water, so they symbolise the authority the Oba has over both land and water, both important trade routes for Benin's economy. You might see crocodiles, the policemen of the waters. They symbolise the Oba's authority to punish wrongdoers. River leaves are really common motifs. The god of wealth, Olokun, lives in the river, so any river symbols are associated with wealth. You'll often see ceremonial weapons called eben, which are kind of paddle-shaped. Ordinary people aren't allowed to wield eben, it's only for the chiefs. One ceremony involves the chiefs throwing their eben into the air as part of a dance. It's pretty tense, because dropping it is a very bad sign. It used to be that if you dropped it in the palace grounds, you'd be executed. These days that doesn't happen anymore, but you do still have to pay a pretty big fine, so they tend to just sort of twirl them a little bit rather than throwing them properly, just to be safe. The plaques are made with something called the lost wax technique. It's a bit of a misleading name. The technique isn't lost, it's the wax that gets lost. Basically, you make a rough base out of clay, and then you cover that with wax, and it's the wax that you carve into your shape. You make it as detailed and as complex as you can, and then you put another layer of clay on top of that, so you've got a wax sandwich and you've got a mould in negative. You heat the whole thing up, and the wax runs out, And now you have an empty mould you can pour your brass into. And once it's cool, you have your plaque. As the period goes on, artists get more confident. Early plaques tend to be in much lower relief, whereas later ones stand out a lot more from the background, until sometimes they're so far off the background you wonder how on earth they made them without breaking. You also see the ability to convey gesture increases a little during the period. Early figures tend to look a little bit more stiff, and they get more natural looking as they get later on. You also see more complicated subject matter with a lot more fine detail. Like in early plaques, you might see characters wearing fairly simple clothes, and towards the end they're covered in all sorts of necklaces and belts and ceremonial hats. Europeans are also depicted. You can tell them apart because they have very different clothes and long hair and long thin noses. They are not depicted because Europeans were in high positions in society in Benin. They're depicted as a conquest of the Oba. Like, the Oba must be really strong and powerful to have these weird exotic creatures at his beck and call. We know a lot about how Europeans started to encounter the wider world in the 16th century, but you rarely get the chance to see it from the African side. Europe had been connected to West Africa for a long time, but any trade had always gone through middlemen going across the Sahara on camel. In 1470, the Portuguese were able to sail around the coast and cut out the middleman for the first time. They brought with them exciting, valuable materials, coral, cowrie shells, cloth from the Far East. In particular, they brought hundreds of tons of brass, cast in the form of manillas, which are a bit like bangles. All this extra brass fueled the brass casting industry in Benin, making more plaques. And in return, Europeans bought things like ivory and pepper and palm oil, as well as people that the Edo had captured as prisoners of war and enslaved. Europeans' movements within Benin were strictly controlled. They were rarely allowed to travel inland or visit the capital, to avoid them trading without the authority of the Oba. But a few of them were invited to the palace. A Dutch visitor described the court as
divided into many magnificent palaces, houses, and apartments of the courtiers, from top to bottom, covered with cast copper, on which are engraved the pictures of their war exploits and battles.
It's strange to hear about Europeans from so long ago who have no problem recognising and deferring to the culture, wealth, and power of an African people. It was totally forbidden for these plaques to leave the country, meaning none had been seen in Europe before 1897. They don't make these to sell, they're supposed to be reserved for the Oba alone, so the only way they would make it out of the country is if they were taken by force. Which leads us to Chapter 3. The British Expedition. In 1897, the British invaded Benin City, burned it to the ground, occupied it, forced the Oba into exile, and took at least a third of the royal treasury. They weren't particularly ashamed, they took photos of it. There are photos of British people in Benin with thousands of these plaques laid out on the ground in rows, looking like corpses in a military hospital. Very quickly after, the loot appears in the British Museum. Now, I don't think the museum sent a curator over to stuff his pockets, but when they were offered plaques from British soldiers, they bought up as many as they could and didn't ask questions. When they went on display, people were shocked to see that an African culture could produce something so beautiful and technically sophisticated. A museum curator at the time, called Charles Hercules Reed, said,
"We were at once astounded at such an unexpected find, and puzzled to account for so highly developed an art among a race so entirely barbarous."
Some people even thought they couldn't possibly be made by Africans. They thought the plaques must be from Israel or ancient Egypt or Portugal, anywhere except modern-day Africa. An article from the London Evening Standard says,
"We were unprepared for examples so bold in conception, curious in design, and perfect in execution, which lend support to the theory that the castings may have been brought to Benin by Arab traders from the north."
They were less ready to accept that Benin could make sophisticated art than the Portuguese traders had been 500 years previously. But the truth couldn't be denied. These are a kind of artwork entirely from Benin. Chapter 4. What next? So what next? No one is disputing that these objects were stolen goods when the museum got them. Nigeria has been asking for them back since it won independence from Britain in the 1960s. As well as being important artworks, the plaques also function kind of like the royal archives. According to the Edo prince Edun Ekenzua, when they were first planning the coronation for Oba Erediauwa in 1979, they weren't sure where to put a particular piece of coronation paraphernalia. But luckily, one of the plaques still in Benin just so happened to show an Oba wearing that regalia, so they could figure out where it was historically worn. But very few plaques have made it back to their country of origin. In 2014, a descendant of a soldier from the original 1897 looting called Mark Walker returned 2 bronzes that he'd inherited to the Oba. And as far as I can tell, these are the only 2 that have made it back. There's an interview with 2 curators at the Rhode Island School of Design's Museum of Art where they bring up some really interesting points. Their museum is too small to have an expert on African art, but they do own a single Benin bronze and have been thinking about how to repatriate it. But when it came to actually getting it back to Nigeria, they realised it was kind of unprecedented. There wasn't a clear procedure for who to give it back to or how. Do you give it to the Nigerian government or the Oba's palace or a Nigerian museum or someone else? And they talk about their very real worry that if they don't get it exactly right first time, they'll scare off any other museums from trying it at all. You sometimes hear the argument that if the British Museum starts giving things back, it'll open the floodgates and everyone will want their stuff back. Well, as we discussed at the beginning, there are still many unbelievable finds in the museum that were legally gotten. And also, good. The plaques are stolen goods. If something was stolen from me, the least I would want would be to get it back. If they wanted to, the British Museum could lobby to have the British Museum Act of 1963 amended, which forbids them from giving away objects, except in very specific circumstances, like it being a duplicate, or so damaged that nobody can learn anything from it anymore. Well, things might be starting to change. In 2018, a new museum called the Benin Royal Museum was announced. It's being overseen by the Benin Dialogue Group, which includes members from Nigeria and the Benin royal family, as well as representatives from museums which have some of these plaques, including the British Museum. Together, they're building a museum in Nigeria where the objects can be held safely. They're going to train up Nigerian curators and Nigerian conservators to preserve these objects in the collection. Now, it won't be everything that was stolen from Benin, and as per the British Museum Act, the objects will be on permanent loan rather than a transfer of ownership. But it is at least a tentative step towards justice. I think at its best, a museum of world cultures like the BM could be a place where British Nigerians and their descendants can see objects from their culture. But at the moment, all it is a reminder of past brutalities. And it's past time to fix it.